The crowd thought they were witnessing the peak with David Bowie on stage. But backstage, Freddie Mercury was just getting started. And when Brian May saw that look on his face, he knew something unforgettable was about to happen. On screen, Bowie was perfect, polished, professional, hitting every mark with the precision of someone who'd calculated each gesture, each note, each moment for maximum impact. And the crowd of 72,000 people responded with appropriate enthusiasm. But Freddie's eyes were narrowed to slits, and his jaw was clenched so tight, Brian could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. And when Brian tried to lighten the mood by saying, "He's giving a good performance," Freddie's response came out ice cold. "Good? Oh, darling, he's perfect. Absolutely perfect. He's raised the bar magnificently, which means I need to jump higher than anyone's ever jumped before." Brian had known Freddie for 15 years, and he'd never heard that particular tone. Not anger, not jealousy, something far more dangerous. Competitive fury wrapped in Arctic calm. The voice of someone who'd just been challenged and was already calculating how to destroy the challenger so completely they'd never dare challenge again. What Brian didn't know, what the 72,000 people in Wembley and the billion watching worldwide had no idea about, was that this wasn't just about Live Aid. This was the culmination of 6 months of Cold War between two of rock's biggest egos, a war that started in a recording studio with Under Pressure and was about to end on the biggest stage in the world, with one of them victorious and one of them forced to acknowledge defeat. This is the story of the 20 minutes that defined Freddie Mercury's legend and the moment David Bowie had to admit he'd been outplayed by someone better. 6 months earlier, the collaboration on Under Pressure had ended in a recording studio argument that nearly became physical. Bowie and Freddie screaming at each other about songwriting credits and royalty splits. Two massive egos colliding like planets. Both men used to being the most important person in any room, suddenly forced to share space. And the fight had ended with Bowie saying something that hit Freddie like a knife. "You always have to be the brightest star in the room, don't you, Freddie? God forbid someone else gets attention. God forbid someone else shines." Freddie had responded with cold fury. "I don't have to be the brightest star, David. I simply am. That's not ego, that's observable fact. And if you can't handle that, perhaps you should find dimmer rooms." They'd finished the song through gritted teeth. It had become a massive hit, and they'd avoided each other completely for 6 months until today. Until Live Aid, until fate and the performance schedule put them on the same stage, on the same day performing within an hour of each other for the largest audience in television history. Now, Freddie watched Bowie's performance with the focus of a general studying enemy tactics, noting every strength, every weakness, every moment where the crowd's enthusiasm was genuine versus polite, cataloging information he'd use in 20 minutes when it was Queen's turn. And Brian watched Freddie watching Bowie and thought, this is going to be either the greatest performance of Freddie's life or a spectacular disaster, because that level of competitive fury either produces transcendence or self-destruction. There's no middle ground. The monitor showed Bowie finishing his set to massive applause, taking his bows with that elegant restraint that was his trademark, exiting stage left with the grace of someone who just delivered exactly what was expected and knew it was good. And Freddie turned away from the monitor with an expression Brian would later describe as a man who'd just been issued a challenge he fully intended to annihilate. What happened next would become legend, but the version people know, Queen's triumphant 20 minutes, the crowd singing "Ayo" in perfect unison, Freddie commanding 72,000 people with a flick of a wrist, that's the public story, the one captured on camera and replayed endlessly. But the private story, the backstage maneuvering and psychological warfare, and the moment two legends acknowledged who'd won, that story stayed hidden for years. Roger Taylor was warming up in Queen's dressing room when Bowie's manager knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a power move that immediately set everyone's teeth on edge. And the manager delivered his message with the casual arrogance of someone representing a bigger star. "David's running a bit long. Crowd's really responding. We'll need to extend his set maybe 5 minutes, which means cutting into your time slot. You'll have 20 minutes instead of 25. Hope that's not a problem." The room went silent because everyone understood what this was: a deliberate attempt to sabotage Queen's performance, to rattle them right before they went on, to give Bowie extra time while limiting theirs. Classic rock star warfare disguised as logistics. And Brian's face went red with fury. Roger started to stand up, looking like he might actually hit someone. But Freddie's voice cut through the tension with that same ice-cold calm. How thoughtful of David to be so concerned with our time management. Please tell him 20 minutes is more than sufficient. In fact, it's perfect. After all, the real question isn't how much time you have, it's what you do with it. I imagine David will do something quite lovely with his 25 minutes. We'll do something they'll remember for the next 40 years with our 20. The manager blinked, unclear if he'd just been insulted or complimented. And Freddie's smile was all teeth, no warmth, the expression of a shark who just spotted blood in the water. And the manager backed out, mumbling something about logistics, and left them alone. Roger exploded the moment the door closed. That son of a bitch is trying to sabotage us. We should complain to the organizers, we should. But Freddie cut him off with a raised hand, and his voice was still calm, but now there was something else underneath. Something heated and fierce and absolutely focused. He's not sabotaging us. He's motivating us. David just handed us the perfect setup. He goes long, takes extra time, builds himself up as the conquering hero, and then we come out and show everyone what real performance looks like. This is a gift. He's given us the perfect storm to walk into and command. Brian studied Freddie's face, trying to read whether this was genuine confidence or bravado masking panic. And what he saw convinced him it was real. Freddie wasn't worried, wasn't stressed, wasn't concerned about the reduced time or Bowie's attempt at one-upmanship. He was energized by it, feeding off the competition like it was fuel. And Brian realized, this is what Freddie needs. This is what makes him transcendent. He needs someone to try to outshine him so he can prove they can't. The next 15 minutes were a masterclass in psychological warfare as Queen prepared to go on. Freddie pacing the dressing room, not with nervous energy, but with the focused intensity of an athlete before competition, doing vocal warm-ups that sounded less like exercises and more like a boxer's training routine. And then there was a knock at the door, and before anyone could respond, David Bowie walked in. The room froze because this was unexpected, unprecedented. Bowie in full stage makeup and costume standing in Queen's dressing room minutes before they were due on stage, and the tension was so thick, Brian could barely breathe. And Bowie's eyes went straight to Freddie like they were the only two people in the room, and what Bowie said next would later be debated endlessly. Good luck out there, Freddie. Big crowd, high stakes. But remember today, you're not competing with me. You're competing with yourself. Don't let the pressure break you. The words could have been genuine encouragement or subtle psychological attacks suggesting Freddie might crack under pressure. And from Bowie's neutral expression, it was impossible to tell which he intended. And for 3 seconds, that felt like 3 years nobody moved. And then Freddie smiled, and Brian felt his blood run cold because that smile was pure predator. And Freddie's response was delivered in a voice so calm it was terrifying. David, darling, I've never competed with anyone in my entire life. I simply win. There's a difference. Competition implies uncertainty about the outcome. I have no uncertainty, but I appreciate your concern for my well-being. It's touching, really. Bowie's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, showing something that might have been anger, or might have been respect, or might have been recognition that he'd just been checkmated in the psychological game. And he nodded once and left without another word. And the moment the door closed, Freddie turned to his band and said 4 words that would define the next 20 minutes. Let's destroy him. What the world saw when Queen took the Wembley stage at 6:41 p.m. on July 13th, 1985, was 20 minutes of performance so perfect, so commanding, so utterly transcendent that it would be talked about for decades as the greatest live performance in rock history. But what the world didn't see was Freddie Mercury channeling 6 months of competitive fury with David Bowie into every gesture, every note, every moment, using his anger and his ego and his absolute refusal to be second best to anyone as fuel for something that went beyond performance into the realm of possession. Like he'd been taken over by some spirit of pure performance and was no longer human, but rather the living embodiment of rock and roll itself. Brian, Roger, and John played perfectly because they had to, because Freddie's intensity demanded it, because anything less than perfection would have been an insult to what Freddie was giving. And when Freddie started the I.O. call and response with 72,000 people, when he conducted them like an orchestra with nothing but his voice in his hands, when he made that entire stadium his instrument, Brian thought, David Bowie is watching this somewhere and realizing he just made a terrible mistake. The performance was structured perfectly for the reduced 20-minute slot Bohemian Rhapsody, truncated to just the opera section and finale. Radio Gaga, with its perfect visual of 72,000 people clapping in unison. Hammer to Fall, with Freddie prowling the stage like he owned it. And We Are the Champions, building to a finale that felt less like a song and more like a coronation. And through it all, Freddie never once looked like he was working or straining or trying. He looked like commanding the world's largest audience was the most natural thing he had ever done, like this was what he was born for. Like every moment of his life had been preparation for these 20 minutes. The moment Queen walked off stage, Freddie didn't celebrate or collapse or show any sign of relief. He simply looked around the backstage area and said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Where's David?" And someone pointed to a viewing area where performers could watch the stage on monitors. And Freddie walked there with that same feline grace he'd shown on stage, still radiating energy and command, and found David Bowie sitting alone in front of a television monitor showing the Live Aid stage where another band was now setting up. And for a long moment, neither man spoke. Freddie sat down in the chair next to Bowie, not asking permission, not hesitating, just claiming the space like he claimed every space he entered. And they sat side by side watching the monitor in silence that stretched and deepened until it felt like the silence itself was a conversation. And finally, Bowie turned to look at Freddie directly, and what he said was delivered without irony or sarcasm, just flat, honest acknowledgement. "God damn it, Freddie, you won." Freddie could have gloated, could have rubbed it in, could have delivered a cutting remark that would have salted the wound, but instead he just nodded once and said simply, "I know." And somehow that was more devastating than any victory speech could have been. That simple acknowledgement that yes, he'd won. Yes, he'd known he would win. Yes, there had never been any real doubt about the outcome. Bowie let out a breath that was half laugh, half something else, and extended his hand for a handshake. And Freddie took it, and they shook firmly. And in that handshake was acknowledgement of the competition and its outcome, respect between titans, and the end of 6 months of Cold War. "The under-pressure fight," Bowie said quietly. "I was wrong. You were right. About the credits, about the performance, about everything. I let ego get in the way of recognizing that sometimes you're in a room with someone who's simply better at what they do than you are." Freddie's response showed why people loved him and feared him in equal measure. "David, you are brilliant, genuinely brilliant. But brilliance isn't enough when you're standing next to someone who's brilliant and completely shameless about it. You calculate. I detonate. That's the difference." They sat together for another few minutes, watching other performers take the stage. Not talking much, just existing in that strange space where competition transforms into mutual respect through acknowledged outcome. And when Freddie finally stood to leave, Bowie asked one question. "Did you know? When I walked into your dressing room before your set, did you already know you were going to destroy everyone?" Freddie's smile was genuine this time. Not the shark smile from earlier, but something almost warm. "David, I always know. That's not confidence, that's not ego, that's just understanding what I can do and doing it. You gave me a gift today. You gave me something to prove, someone to beat, a reason to be better than good. I should thank you." Bowie shook his head slowly. "Don't thank me. I just watched you do something I've never seen anyone do before. You didn't perform for that crowd. You possessed them. There's a difference." Freddie started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "One more thing, David. About Under Pressure, it's a better song because we fought over it. The tension, the conflict. Two voices fighting for dominance. That's what makes it work. So maybe we needed that studio battle to create something that good. Maybe competition isn't always destructive. Bowie considered this and nodded slowly. Maybe, but let's not test that theory again. Once per lifetime is enough. They both laughed, and it was real laughter, not performance. And then Freddie walked away to find his bandmates, and Bowie sat alone with his thoughts and the knowledge that he'd just witnessed something he'd never be able to replicate. Years later, Bowie would tell interviewers that Live Aid was the moment he realized there were performers, and then there were forces of nature, and Freddie Mercury was the latter. And you couldn't compete with a force of nature any more than you could compete with a hurricane or an earthquake. You could only witness it and hope you survived the experience. Brian May would say that the backstage tension with Bowie was what focused Freddie into that laser beam intensity that made the performance transcendent. That without something to prove and someone to prove it to, Freddie might have been merely great instead of legendary. Roger Taylor admitted he'd been terrified going on stage after Bowie's attempt to cut their time, worried they'd be sabotaged or diminished. But watching Freddie transform that sabotage into motivation taught him something about how champions think. They don't fear challenges, they weaponize them. The 20 minutes of Queen at Live Aid became the performance everyone remembers, the one that defines the entire concert despite dozens of other legendary acts performing that day. And while the official story attributes that to Freddie's natural charisma and Queen's tight performance, the real story is about ego and competition, and one man's absolute refusal to let anyone outshine him on the world's biggest stage. David Bowie never spoke publicly about the backstage confrontation or the post-performance acknowledgement of defeat, maintaining his characteristic discretion. But people close to him said Live Aid changed how he approached performance, made him realize that calculation and precision weren't always enough. Sometimes you needed the willingness to completely let go and risk everything on a single moment. Freddie never mentioned Bowie's pre-show visit or the post-show confession, keeping that private as he kept most things that mattered private. But in later interviews, when asked about Live Aid, he'd get a particular smile and say simply, "It was a good day. I did what I do. The crowd did what crowds do. Magic happened." The footage of Queen at Live Aid has been watched hundreds of millions of times, analyzed frame by frame, studied as a masterclass in performance. But the real story isn't visible on camera. It's in the psychology, the backstage warfare, the moment when David Bowie tried to steal Freddie's thunder by cutting their time, and Freddie responded by creating 20 minutes so perfect that 35 years later, people still argue nothing has ever matched it. It's in Freddie watching Bowie's performance with cold calculation, cataloging every moment, every response, every opportunity to do better. It's in Bowie walking into Queen's dressing room, trying to psych Freddie out and getting psyched out himself by someone who simply didn't believe losing was possible. It's in those 20 minutes where Freddie took 6 months of competitive fury and transformed it into transcendence. And it's in the moment after, sitting side by side in front of his television monitor, when one legend told another, "You won," and heard back, "I know." And both men understood that acknowledgement was more valuable than any trophy. The Wembley crowd of 72,000 people thought they were watching a charity concert. What they actually witnessed was the resolution of a war between titans and the coronation of one of them as unchallengeable king. Freddie Mercury didn't just perform at Live Aid. He won it decisively, devastatingly, completely. And David Bowie, to his eternal credit, acknowledged it without hesitation or excuse. Two legends, one stage, one victor. One afternoon when thunder wasn't stolen, it was claimed by someone who'd always known it belonged to him.